Welcome everyone to this beautiful occasion, an articulation of one to remember. Today, we are featuring the works of Maxine Ewaschuck and Rabbi Aaron Levy, a duo both from Canada, bringing us the arts of the Great North. Rabbi Aaron Levy is the founder of Makom, found in downtown Toronto. Maxine Ewaschuck is a student at University of Toronto, and both bring us beautiful art in Torah. And without further ado, I don't want to prolong this anymore. Rabbi Aaron, would you frame the parsha for us?
Sure. Thanks, Javier. And hi, everybody. Nice to see many of you whom I don't know and a few of you whom I do know. I'm going to share a source sheet to help ground our learning tonight a little bit. Give me one moment for that. Okay. We're reading Parashat Terumah. The word Terumah is definitely an important word, both in the parasha and in the art that Maxine has created. Terumah means like a giving up, related to the word laharim, to lift up, to raise up. And it means a contribution, something that you're raising up to give. The parasha begins with God saying to Moshe to tell the Jewish people, take contributions from everyone whose heart is willing, and all kinds of materials, in order to make a mikdash, a holy place, so that God, v'shachanti b'tocham, will dwell among them. And God is then going to go ahead and give the blueprints for what this thing should look like. And without giving the whole rest of the parasha, here is a drawing of what the Mishkan may have looked like, where you have an exterior courtyard that is 100 cubits by 50 cubits, which is to say it's 150 feet by 75 feet. Or to kind of put that in maybe a more real-world perspective, it's about half the length and half the width of a Canadian football field or an American football field. Take your pick. They're more or less the same size. So it's a pretty big space. And of course, within it, we have both the outside space and the outdoor furniture, so to speak, of the altar and the wash basin. And then we have the main event, which is the Mishkan, the dwelling itself, which is a wooden structure that has 4 layers of fabric that are hand woven over top of it. So the whole parasha of Terumah really is a very detailed listing of the materials and the different pieces and the instructions for how they should be made and placed together for this whole space. I will, I think, leave it at that for now, just as sort of a contextualizing of the parasha. Oh, maybe also important to mention that really this parasha and the next 4 parshiot are really all focused on the Mishkan. So first we have basically 2 parashiot of instructions for building the Mishkan. Then we have a kind of not exactly tangent, but a segue to a census and the incident of the golden calf. And then we have 2 parashiot that are about the actual building of the Mishkan, its construction. So these 5 parashiot really are a literary unit, and Terumah kicks us off for that.
So, I think we're gonna trade off pretty frequently, I think, speaking about different parts of the work. So I kind of decided that instead of going right into, the instructions that are described for the building of the Mishkan, since that is kind of the topic of the next few parshiot, I wanted to, leave some things for the other artists. So really what I've done is kind of like a very early on, like pre-construction scene. Yeah, and I guess one of the first things that we were speaking about were, of course, the first few psukim, and there are just, it's such a simple way to start with just the Vaydaber Hashem al Moshe Lemor. It's very, it's something we see all the time, but in this one kind of command, non-command, there is so much that the Meforshim read into it. So we're looking kind of, we just had Parshat Mishpatim. It's a very halakhically dense parsha, and toward kind of the end of this cycle, we're just getting a lot of really clear instructions and commandments, whereas for this it is Kuli Shasher Yudbenu Libo. It we're given an instruction, but it is there for anyone who is willing to do it, for anyone whose heart is moved to contribute. And there were, that is just, it's a striking difference from most of these commandments we're getting. And there is something there, I think, that seems like it would be very laudable, that you might go and just give everything you have to the building of the Mishkan, but of course that is not what happens. There is a limit to how much is accepted, and that is something that I will probably get to later. What I want to talk about right now is just, where these things are coming from. Of course, it hasn't been long since all of the people left Egypt. They were slaves there. Presumably, they did not have many valuable possessions. All of these things that are listed are probably not things that people would have really had access to. Now, of course, we see right before the Israelites leave, they take from the Egyptians all of these valuable items. And there is, of course, this can kind of strike one as a bit odd, wouldn't you just want to get out with your lives? But there is something important there. The Israelites have been doing all of this labor, and in order for them to kind of set up a working social structure, a system that they can all live by reasonably, there are certain, material needs that have to be fulfilled. And I think it's also really striking. I think that in one way, you might think that people wouldn't have necessarily developed that much of an attachment to the things that they took from Egypt. At the same time, I could also imagine all these people kind of having like a scarcity mentality. All of a sudden they have these things for the first time in their lives, really. And so it is quite moving, I think, that people are so willing to give up these things. Now, there is one item in particular that from some of the Midrashim, if we just scroll down a bit, is this copper mirror. This is something that we do know that the Israelite women had. If you do put stock in various midrashim and not actually, in various midrashim that explain how they were used, but actually in the text of a later parsha, it will come up that the women's copper mirrors get used to make the washing basin. So that is something very clear that I wanted to highlight there.
So I'm going to jump in a little bit to give some sources to ground what Maxine was just talking about in her artwork. So, okay, Maxine mentioned that although the beginning of the parasha just asks people to bring whatever they're willing to give, eventually there's a limit to that. So we read much later on in Parashat Vayakel, but still within these 5 parashiot that are about the Mishkan, that are about the tabernacle, that the chief builders, Bezalel and Oholiav, say, hey, enough already. We don't need any more stuff. We have more than enough here. So they tell that to Moshe, who then makes a proclamation throughout all of the Israelite encampment, like no one is allowed to bring anything further. So people stop bringing because hamlacha hayta dayam l'chol hamlacha la'asot ota v'hoter. Their efforts had been more than enough for all the tasks to be done. So even with this idea of free will offering, there's still some notion of boundaries to it, some limits. It's not exclusively an expression of people's kind of overflowing generosity with no borders whatsoever. So even though there seems to be some contrast, as Maxine was pointing out, with Mishpatim, the previous parasha that's very legalistic, and this parasha that starts off with everyone's just bringing whatever they want, or not whatever they want, but as much as they want amongst the required materials, that there still is a limit eventually placed. Another theme that Maxine brought up is the idea of commandedness versus voluntary gifts. And so we have in the Talmud a statement, and I picked here a place from Avodah Zarah, but it appears a few other times as well. Amar Rabbi Chanina, Gadol ha-mitzuveh ve'oseh, yoter mishe'enu mitzuveh ve'oseh. Rabbi Chanina said, greater is one who is commanded and does it, meaning does the commandment, than one who is not commanded and does it. So this idea that, at least within rabbinic Judaism, that it's better to actually do something out of a sense of obligation than do it purely voluntarily. Now, you could potentially construct an opposing view as well, but this definitely becomes a dominant idea within rabbinic Judaism. And then the intersection of that with gendering is an interesting one, because at the beginning of this week's parasha, we have, here I'll flip up to it, Kol ish asher yidvenu libo. So you could translate it as every man whose heart so moves him. But especially considering later on in the Torah, we have Kol ish v'isha, every man and woman. That seems to imply that the ish here means just person. So I translated it that way here, from every person whose heart is willing. So the voluntary nature of contributions to the Mishkan seems to be gender inclusive. But then when we start getting into later rabbinic ideas of mitzvot and commandedness, so we have this source here from the Mishnah, the idea that mitzvot that are positive and time-bound, meaning they're mitzvot to do as opposed to things not to do, and that they have a certain time frame for them. Men are obligated, women are exempt. And any positive commandment that's not time-bound, both men and women are equally obligated. But then for negative commandments, whether they're time-bound or not, generally speaking, men and women are equally obligated. But the small subset of positive mitzvot that are time-bound, from which women, according to this Mishnah, are considered exempt, then becomes a major source for not only exempting women from the necessity of performing certain mitzvot, but actually excluding them from it in the halachic development over the millennia. So that's something that Maxine is definitely alluding to in her work as well. And the tension between the free will nature of giving to build the Mishkan versus the idea of having limits, and the idea of everyone being equally included versus an exclusion of women from certain areas of traditional practice. Back to you, Maxine.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I guess in my work, I can never really escape text itself. It's even though I am, using visual arts and it's figurative, what it is I'm doing with that. I'm supposed to be using images, but I can't help putting some words in there too. So this is this idea that the fact that women are exempt kind of getting extended, kind of in connection with this Gadol Mitzuvevose. The way it gets extended to actually excluding women, not just exempting them from certain mitzvot, specifically ones that are kind of communally and ritually oriented, is something that in a lot of ways has just kind of become something that we're used to. So this is what made me kind of think of this phrase of Kedat Moshe Israel, which is part of, the kind of active statement in Kiddushin. So when we're talking about, when a couple is getting married, the chassan says, like, I betroth you to me in like Kedat Moshe Israel, which often gets translated to, according to the law of Moshe and Israel, but really it means like the knowledge of Moshe and Israel. And I think that we can very easily stick to, just what we know and what we have seen before. And I think that those are, of course, always like important things to work with. We stand on the shoulders of giants in a lot of ways. Like, who am I to say that I know so much better than the people who have come before me? But at the same time, I think that there is kind of another evaluation here where we have to, or we should be looking at, what people are able to contribute and want to contribute. And I think there is something just about like an artistic practice that you are creating something new with your hands that is something that really compels me. Of course, I feel this kind of connects to a bit of the, sometimes a frustration or dissatisfaction that I have with some of the limits that are placed on myself as a woman in, Orthodox Jewish practice. But also this statement of Kedat Moshe Israel, it's not just one that is connected to this ambivalence that I have here. It is also something I think that connects to the conceptions of the Mishkan in other ways that I find, more positive. And I think I don't want to be kind of, a bit of a head in the clouds artist, but there is, kind of an amorous nature of the relationship between God and the Jewish people that is especially significant at this kind of early point in the Midbar. It's referred to in Shir Hashirim, and the rabbis bring all sorts of intertexts there with this time in the Midbar being kind of like a honeymoon period. And Rabbi Aaron and I were looking at some texts that describe the Mishkan as a chuppah. So if you want to take us through some of those, Rabbi.
I actually didn't bring those. I didn't put those in my source sheet, but there's something else that you brought up that I do want to show some sources for. When Maxine mentioned the materials used to build the Mishkan, and the obvious question that it raises is like, where did a group of recently ex-slaves get all this, nice stuff from? And so let's take a look at a few sources regarding that. Okay. So even before the Exodus, when Moshe is in the Sinai by himself and has the experience of the burning bush, and God says, here's what you're going to do. You're going to go back into Mitzrayim, into Egypt, and you're going to, help bring the people out. Already at that early point, God says, and I will give this people, Israelites, favor in the eyes of the Egyptians, so that when you go, you will not go away empty-handed. Each woman shall request from her neighbor and the lodger in her house silver items and gold items and clothing, and you shall put these on your sons and daughters, thus stripping the Egyptians. So, and then that gets reiterated when the Israelites are about to leave Egypt, that they should request stuff from the Egyptians to take with them. Now, there's a whole question of like, well, why should the Egyptians give them stuff? Is it because it's under duress? Because they're afraid of the plagues and they're afraid of the Israelites? So they're just saying like, okay, here's some stuff, just, get away from us. Is it something that's being unjustly taken? Or also depending on how one translate this word here, v'sha'ala, if you translate it as request, then okay, you have these questions about was it being given under duress? But at least it's an honest ask, saying just like, hey, give us stuff before we leave. But if you translate v'sha'ala as borrow, that the Israelites should borrow stuff from the Egyptians, and that's how they phrase it to the Egyptians, then it also raises the question of, was it a total lie? Were they saying, oh, we're just going to borrow some stuff and we're going to bring it back in a few days? But of course, they had no intention of returning. So if we look at the commentary of Chizkuni on this speech from God at the burning bush, he says, "V'nitzaltem et Mitzrim bischar shibud avodat parech," thus stripping the Egyptians in compensation for forced labor slavery. So he says that this is basically reparations. That the Egyptians owed the Israelites hundreds of years worth of compensation for their labor. And so when the Israelites either ask for it or say they just want to borrow it, either way, it's owed to them for real. And then the Seventh Lubavitcher Rebbe makes the explicit connection between that stuff taken from the Egyptians and the building of the Mishkan. So he says, how is it that that they had all this stuff? He says, and it seems that, of course, regarding the silver, gold, and copper, we already learned above, the Israelites were customers of the Egyptians, items of silver and gold, etc. So, it matches up. And so it must be that the material that they took from the Egyptians, aka reparations, are being used to build the Mishkan. If you want to learn further about that, I highly recommend an article by my friend, Rabbi Aryeh Bernstein, who has an article called, now I'm blanking on the name of it. It's the Torah
case for reparations.
Torah case for reparations. Thank you, everybody. Yes, like Ta-Nehisiot's piece. So yes, the Torah case for reparations. You can do a real deep dive into that topic through his article. Okay, so that was a little bit of background about that. Maxine, were there other parts of your art that you wanted to talk about?
I guess so. Yeah, I wanted to kind of go back to this kind of marriage idea. I think this might tie things together, but Rashi at one point cites the Midrash Tanchuma, kind of, it comes later, but there is a pasuk that I mentioned before, where it says that these women gave their mirrors to Moshe. Now, in the Midrash and what Rashi says about this pasuk is that Moshe at first rejected them, because they're these objects that, the way that they've been used before and what they represent and what they will bring to the Mishkan are, it's this kind of vessel of vanity. And, that's not something that you would want necessarily where you are, doing Avodat Hashem. But then God responds to Moshe and says, and this is something that Rashi adds, actually, that no, these mirrors are beloved to me. And the explanation for that is this story about, when the Egyptians tried to keep Jewish couples, separate from one another. And so these couples would, go out to the field. They would have to kind of act kind of furtively. And these women would, kind of look at their husbands in the mirror to kind of communicate and say that they were going to go somewhere to meet each other. And, this happened over generations. And that is actually how, the Jewish people survived and even grew in that time. And there is something there, I think, that brings together this kind of idea of, the divine partnership, the divine human partnership that is happening in the kind of romance there, and anchors that, connects it with love between people that gets expressed kind of in these one-on-one intimate relationships. But, it's also something that I really see happening with the whole community here, the way that people are willing to give all of their things up for something that is, for the whole community. Also, not just things that they just acquired, but these copper mirrors, which I imagine were, some of the only kind of valuable possessions that these women had at the time. This material that, Moshe at first thinks like is kind of tainted somehow, actually kind of forms like the basis of this this structure that serves again like as kind of a chuppah for God and the Jewish people.
I have the midrash from Psikta Rav Kahana now ready to roll about the comparison of the Mishkan to a chuppah. So I will screen share that, not from a nicely formatted source sheet, but just straight from Sefaria. So if everyone looks here, so this is from the first sermon, you could say, within this midrashic text, Psikta Rav Kahana, and it's for Hanukkah. Psikta Rav Kahana is a collection of basically like midrashic sermons for different special Shabbats and special holidays. And so it's not just sort of like little bit like one-liner kind of midrashim, it's sort of longer explorations of themes. And here it's on the verse from Bimidbar, from Numbers, Vahi Kalot Moshe, when Moshe finished with the inauguration of the Mishkan, then God's presence came into it. And because that's part of the Torah reading on Hanukkah, so the Midrash here is playing off of that. And we have here, Amar Rabbi Chanina, Limadatich, Torah derech eretz. So Rabbi Chanina says, this is to teach you, this is for the Torah to teach you derech eretz, proper civil behavior, so that a groom should not enter into a chuppah until the bride has given him permission. And then it gives a proof text for this, Yavo Dodi Legano, from Song of Songs, Shir Shirim. My beloved will come into his garden. So this is the feminine voice within Shir Shirim saying, my my beloved, which is the masculine, will come into his garden. V'charkach bati legani, and then after that you have the masculine voice in the next chapter saying, I came into the garden, I came into my garden, right? So first the feminine is inviting the masculine in, and then the masculine is actually entering. And so it's saying, so too with the Mishkan, that basically the God has to be invited into the Mishkan. The Mishkan is like a chuppah, and God has to be invited in by the people. What's particularly interesting also is sort of like the gender bending that's happening here, because so here the people are the feminine, like the bride under the chuppah, and God is the masculine. But elsewhere, we have the idea that that things are reversed. So anyway, it gets interesting on a gender level without kind of going through tons of text here. But so there we have a comparison textually to a chuppah with the Mishkan as symbolizing that, and this idea that it's a site of love between God and the Jewish people. Okay. Maxine, was there anything else you wanted to say?
I think we're going to probably move into that. I guess Lydia is saying something that there's something interesting about the gender bending there, and yeah, I agree. And there is just kind of one more thing that reminds me of. that we often get this kind of default, or there's the imagery of God as a masculine figure comes up in the literature more often than feminine, and that is something that, of course, is like thought about a lot in Shir Shirim. Usually we kind of associate the male voice with God and the female voice with Israel. Now, in my piece, I think I've called it a painting a few times, but there's more going on than that. I have the pillar of smoke is not just painted. I've actually sewn tulle over it. And so there is something that is, covering it like a veil. And there is, this image later that we see of like inviting God into the Mishkan, under the chuppah. So we actually see, God as like a kind of like a bride figure here, that I was kind of playing with as well. That kind of struck me while I was working on it.
By the way, just to further the idea, within that same kind of run of midrashic interpretations within Sikh Rav Kahana, while the particular one that we looked at textually, God is masculine, there are other ones within like the same, few sentences away where it's talking about bringing the Shekhinah down to earth, and the Shekhinah is feminine. So that's sort of the gender bending that I was alluding to. Maxine, do you want to talk more about the different materials that you used?
Sure. So it's the work is, at its base, an acrylic painting on canvas. That's not my usual medium, but I thought just, for like the scale that I wanted to work on, this was kind of my best option. And then I also used, cotton embroidery floss. That's something that feels a bit more like home for me. Which also is, so there's cotton embroidery floss, you can kind of see some in her hair. There is a larger, or I guess it's a smaller gauge wool yarn. So that is something that I wanted to bring in as well, this kind of textile work, because that is something that is a big part of the Mishkan, from the outside right into kind of the center with the parochet. And also it's this came up in a few of the sources that Rabbi Aaron and I spoke about, and I don't think we'll really have enough time to get to fully, but later on we'll see that the women do the textile work that went into the building of the Mishkan, and this kind of association between women and textile work gets played out in more and less complementary ways as we look through rabbinic literature as well. And then what else? Beads, lots of glass beads, some brass as well in there. Also some lapis lazuli, which is listed in the text. Although, some of these things we're not 100% sure what, various minerals were. But also the red, more kind of irregular elements there are coral. And, something that I chose just because it was striking, and the irregularity was something that was interesting for me to work with, but also to me it kind of recalled like part of the journey of crossing Yam Suf, and yeah.
So I want to just briefly riff on the variety of materials that were used in the Mishkan and in Maxine's art. I'm going to share a couple more sources real fast. Okay, so within this week's parasha, in the second chapter of it, we have Ve'asita chamishim karsei zahav v'chibarta et hayiriot isha el achota bakrasim v'haya mishkan echad. You shall make 50 clasps of gold, and you shall join the curtains one to another with the clasps, so that the mishkan be one. This is talking about the lowermost or innermost layer of tapestries that were woven by women to cover the actual mishkan, this wooden rectangular box. So there were these there were these 10 curtains that were joined together. Well, first 5 were sewn together and 5 were sewn together, but then these 2 bigger curtains then are connected with these 50 golden clasps, in order that the Mishkan be one, this tent, this dwelling be one. So interestingly, Ibn Ezra comments on that, and it seems that maybe he's perhaps bothered by, like, why does it have to say HaMishkan Echad, the Mishkan is one? You could just say, there's 50 golden clasps and they join the curtains together to make one bigger curtain, right? Why do you have to say, so the Mishkan will be one? So he says, Eser Yiriyot Hu HaMishkan, VeMishkan Karu Echad Kolel HaKol. So see, the 10 curtains are the tabernacle, and the tabernacle is called one and encompasses all. So he's saying that these 10 curtains are basically synonymous with the Mishkan itself. And even though these disparate pieces, they become this one thing, they have this one name of Mishkan. It includes everything that's in it. And then he broadens his focus to get more philosophical. Ki kol guf eno dvar echad, rak hu mechubar me'achadim. Every entity, every body is not one thing, but is made from multiple pieces. Kacha Hashem anichbad. This is how God is. Shehu echad kolel hakol v'nikra echad. God is one and contains everything and is called one. V'chein ha'olam hakatan v'hagadol. And so too, the small world, the microcosm, and the big world, the olam hagadol, the macrocosm. So there's a lot going on in here, but what he's basically getting at in his medieval philosophical rationalist way is the idea that the Mishkan is a model for the unity of the whole universe and of God, and that God contains the entire universe. You see part of this idea in Rambam, in the Guide for the Perplexed, but he talks about the whole universe being one organism, and it's no different than we think of like ourselves. We have different limbs, but we're one person, right? With one soul. He says the whole universe is one organism with one soul. It just has different limbs, but really they're all part of the one thing. But Rambam doesn't include God within that, because for Rambam, God is purely transcendent, totally outside the physical realm. But if we look at some Kabbalah, so Rabbi Moshe Cordovero, very important Kabbalist, for whom we have to thank for composing the service of Kabbalat Shabbat, for welcoming Shabbat, his creation. So he writes that, I'll just sort of jump, here we go. She'ein shum nimtza shelo yeh koach ha'eloah bo. There is nothing that doesn't have the power of God in it. He's saying that everything that exists is not separate from God. That would be saying that there is something that's not God, that's giving a boundary to God, a limitation to God, and that's not philosophically cool or theologically cool. So he's saying that like God subsumes everything, and then he concludes, Ella ha'eloah kol nimtza. God is everything that exists. Ve'en kol nimtza ha'eloah. But everything that exists is not God. So there's a good paradox. So this idea that God includes everything, but like don't be misled and think that like, oh, the sum total of all physical stuff is God. No, God is both everything. God is totally immanent, but God is also transcendent. God is also beyond everything at the same time. So I think that if we see the Mishkan as not a dwelling for God, but rather as a space, a physical architectural work that is trying to represent or really bring God consciousness into the middle of Bnei Israel, the children of Israel who are camped around it, and teach them about the nature of God, the universe, and everything, by showing like, hey, we've got all these different pieces, but they are creating, or they're combining to create one whole thing. And that is parallel to how we relate to our own bodies, how we should relate to the whole universe, and how we should relate to the idea of God as containing everything. And what struck me in looking at Maxine's work is that you could really say the same thing about art, that art tells us both something about the artist behind it, just as the Mishkan tells us about the architect behind it, being God, and hopefully also the idea of like looking at art and seeing how an artist is able to take disparate materials, right? Like Maxine was talking about canvas and acrylic paint and beads and metals and fabric and thread, and how it all creates one whole thing, right? And so when we look at that, hopefully that can inspire us to reflect on the unity really of everything all around us.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think that really does speak to the power of art to do just that. And I think that, it's something that isn't really paid much attention to is that, one of the first things that happens after, this experience of revelation, one of the first things that the people do in response to that is they get together to create something together. And that, that is kind of what keeps their relationship with God and that kind of communication open. We looked a bit at the Ramban on the opening of the Parsha, and he writes about how the Mishkan is kind of like an extension of the experience at Har Sinai, that experience at Har Sinai kind of like lives on in the Mishkan. And I think that, the fact that it is something that the people made with their hands, of course, in response to the commandments and, this kind of call that they got from God. I think that is that's very powerful to me, at least.
Wow, really, this is like, it's been so incredible hearing the back and forth ping-ponging between the commentaries and the text and the art. We're going to open up for questions and bring the conversation with the whole kahila that we have here. Richard, would you like to kick us off?
Sure. Wow, what a wonderful presentation, both Aaron and Maxime. The first thing I noticed in your painting, could we get the painting up?
Yes.
The thing that struck me, as I'm kind of working visually through it, was this foreground figure. And the first thing that I thought I saw was in the lower left, a very possibly female figure holding what seemed to be something, well, clearly in a basket. And my first assumption was that, in fact, this was a woman holding a child. And so that was, oh, my goodness, how wonderful that somehow the Mishkan should evoke this kind of generative image. But of course, as you described it, no, I was wrong. Really, what she's holding is a basket with a mirror in it. Well, okay, and then as you explained the midrash about the mirror and Moshe Rabbeinu's problems with the mirrors that the women wanted to give to the building of the Mishkan, and then God said, no, Moshe, no, you're not getting this. These mirrors are really very important, and really so, but so what the mirror is, and this is the great midrash, which you didn't quite totally quote, at least I didn't think I heard it. It is a midrash it's also based upon Shir Hashirim, is that under the apple trees, the Jewish women in Egypt enticed their husbands with mirrors. They prettied themselves. They essentially aroused their husbands by their beauty and showing, look at me, back and forth, and of course allowed them then, in fact, to desire the husbands to desire their wives, because they were exhausted by being slaves, right? But that allowed the Jewish people to live and to procreate, as in fact you said. And then I suddenly realized, look at what you've done. You effectively, though, have done is you've put the product of the mirrors in the mirror. It's about children, of course. And so suddenly your piece takes on a whole dimension that you alluded to in this discussion, but it's really, to me, enormously beautiful. And you have it both ways. You have the mirror, because there she is actually looking at herself. But then my initial image was, this is like a child in that basket. Well, it's both, because it's the future. It's that future child that will come. Anyway, so really wonderful discussion. I love your piece. I love the jewels. I love the sumptuousness of it. But that was my little take on what you did. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much. Wow. Yeah, that kind of also gets at something else that I really kind of try to keep in mind. And I know it's something that I've spoken to some people here about quite a bit, but it's trying to kind of hold kind of traditional feminine roles in the family as something that are, of course, hugely important. And it's work, of course, in very kind of traditional spaces like that work of, the woman kind of raising the family is kind of the center of her Avodat Hashem. And right, like I want to kind of like acknowledge that and hold that, even though, I definitely feel very compelled toward other types of Avodat Hashem, with like Talmud Torah and Tefillah, which are more classically male. And so there is something that, I wanted to kind of, that I always want to kind of bring together, that I want to have both, or at least acknowledge both as valid options.
And here you put it in the foreground.
Yeah.
I mean, and also, by the way, by putting in the foreground, you also make us see it, as it were, through her eyes.
Mm-hmm.
So anyway, really beautiful. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Also, in your piece description, you mentioned that the mirror, instead of having her look at herself through the mirror, she's looking at the viewer, who are eventually going to be the progeny of us. Yeah. That it comes from that mirror that we're here today. Beautiful. Ewaschuck, would you like to come forth and present us with your question?
Shalom Aleichem. Miss Lee said something very interesting, and I just wanted to highlight that. She said that part of a woman's avodat Hashem was child rearing, and that kind of reminded me of the concept that obviously we're all made Tselem Elohim, but the big question is like, why did Hashem create anything? Like, why did Hashem have to create? And a big expression of like, kind of like, there's no key answer, but like the base kind of consensus, like Hashem just had to do it. Like Hashem just had to create creation. That's just what had to happen. And I was just curious, like, how much is it that like the individuals created Tselem Elohim that we just need to create, and we have to have a release of a creative outlet, and how much that is a divine service of Avodat Hashem, just being able to create in any capacity. And if you want to highlight on that.
Yeah, I guess that what that immediately makes me think of is Rav Soloveitchik's Lonely Man of Faith, talking about, Adam 1 and Adam 2. So, based on these kinds of characterizations of the two side-by-side narratives in Bereshit. So the first one is more about kind of human mastery over the environment and that ability to create. And then the other side is, Adam 2 is kind of more of this person who wants to be in relationship, with another person, like with Chava, or, but with God in very large part. And that is definitely, those are two dynamics that are kind of, that the Rav says, parallel these aspects of God as a creator. I think that is absolutely true. And I think that there's something, again, really wonderful about the Mishkan in particular. And I think what a lot of artists are hoping to do, which is on one hand, satisfy this need to create, but also to use that as a way to be in relationship with the divine, with other people. And again, that's, one of the reasons that I had the woman not necessarily looking at herself in the mirror, but looking at the viewer. I was really hoping to kind of bring us into that in some way, especially, now that, like the Mishkan was temporary. And in the end, in the end, not in the end, but as of right now, like we don't have, the Beit HaMikdash, which came afterward, and kind of, took the place of the Mishkan. I guess in some ways I find, and I think we all find that idea of like an extremely kind of centralized way of worship kind of like a little bit difficult to connect with. So there is something that I wanted to kind of like viscerally create a, personal relationship between the person and the work of like what will become the Mishkan. But I also think that is a bit of a way in a different way, and that all of the people who wanted to were contributing to what went into building the Mishkan, like the actual materials. And then, it was also the community who was building the Mishkan, even if, later on, it was only like a select few who were actually doing the work there. And I didn't realize you were here until you spoke. So glad you made it.
just mention real fast to piggyback off of what Maxine was saying in response to Yitzchak's query, that there's also certain parallels between the building of the Mishkan and Maseh Breshit, God's work of creation back in Genesis. Most obviously with the idea like God stops creating to rest on Shabbat. And as we see through the span of the 5 parashiot that are about the Mishkan, that even the building of the Mishkan, as important as it is, creating holy space, has to stop for Shabbat. And so the idea of, just as the Mishkan was created through loving gifts, so too seeing creation as loving gift.
Wow. That was incredible. Just thank you, really, both of you, the way that you've brought art and brought all of these. You not only wove together, literally stitched together the phrases of the Torah into your art, but you've also stitched together all of these incredible conversations that have spanned millennia of all of these rabbis and all of these commentaries. And in that sense, the Mishkan is still being built. And as all of these commentaries and all of this art continues to be created through your own interpretations, it keeps the Mishkan mission and it keeps the Torah mission alive. And so just thank you, both of you, for this beautiful evening that you've shared such insightful ideas about marriage and devotion and volunteerism and duty and obligation. And it's just been a wonderful evening. Thank you all for attending. And if you want to read and hear more about this piece, you can find it at the Amen Institute's website. Have a beautiful evening. Take care.
Thank you so much.
Good night, y'all. Take
Good
care.
night.